proud of. And I wanted to start, I recently traveled to Louisiana, and I'm in love with the music there, the Zydeco Cajun music. And it was interesting because there's kind of two strands. There's the Cajun music, which is very kind of a white music, and then there's the Zydeco, which is more of an African-American history. But what's interesting is they kind of have common roots as different people mixed around in Louisiana, and so many different influences and spices, whether it was French, Creole, you know. And the African-Americans there, a lot of them were called Creole, which means of mixed blood, whether it's African-American, French, Spanish, American Indian. So, but what's interesting is that we think, I don't know if you ever heard Cajun music. I'm going to play you some in a minute. It's definitely a honky kind of music. It doesn't strike you as African-American. But one of the guys who was one of the pioneers of it was an African-American. No one knows who he is, but I think of him as an American hero. I want to show you just a 5-minute film, really touching, about him. And it kind of fires us up to see why we had the Black Empowerment Awakening years later. Kind of a reminder of why we're in it for this social justice thing, we Unitarians. So we'll have the lights go out up here, and I'll just show you this 5-minute piece. His name was Amadi Ardouan.
We can't turn off all of them because of that.
So there you have this touching story. And this guy's death was not in vain because he ended up giving birth to this amazing musical culture that's down. If you ever go to Louisiana, all that Zydeco music, which is the African-American, and all the white Cajun music, it all stems from this guy who had the courage to play with a white fiddle player at all these white and black dances back in the 1920s, 1930s. This was unheard of at the time in the South. So he's a true champion. He was a hero, a warrior. But these type of stories are what inspire Unitarian Universalists, and they inspired us to try to make a difference a few decades later in the civil rights movement. So I just wanted to set the tone with that and then talk about our heritage in trying to help make this world a better place. In 1965, Selma, Alabama, African Americans under Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King were organizing protests and marches just to gain the simple right to register to vote without being killed. Of course, it was legal to vote, but just try and do it in a place like Louisiana. And the organized protests gained a momentum. The authorities fought back. On February 18th, 1965, the Alabama state trooper shot an African American named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was fleeing from a protest. He ended up dying. And so Martin Luther King started organizing these rallies, these marches. There was one from Selma to Montgomery in March 1965. It didn't get that far. It was a disaster. It was called Bloody Sunday because the marchers were attacked by state and local police with billy clubs and tear gas. But the march did make the news. Martin Luther King organized a second march 2 days later, and he called for all Americans to be there. At this point, it wasn't a multiracial issue yet. It was just, African Americans really marching. But there were some whites who didn't show up, including 3 white Unitarian Universalist ministers, Reverend Orloff Miller, Reverend Clark Olson, Reverend James Reeb. And basically that march did not receive court permission to proceed to Montgomery, so Dr. King led 2,500 people to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they had a short prayer session there. Then everyone turned around and went home. And that night, the 3 UU ministers were eating at some restaurant, and they were taken outside and beaten. And Reverend James Reeb from Boston, he died 2 days later. And that's suddenly when white America started paying attention because a white person had died. So that's the unfortunate truth, but this is the history that we deal with. Unitarians, of course, went wild with this, at this news. At that time, back in Boston, the UUA Board of Trustees was meeting, and they heard about this news, and they said, you know what? This meeting is adjourned. We reconvene in Selma, Alabama. And that's what they did. They reconvened on that bridge. And I guess at least 200 Unitarian Universalists went, mostly ministers, all the way to Selma. There's a Reverend Robert Eller Isaacs who remembers, I actually believe the defining moment in Unitarian Universalism was Selma. It was the moment when Martin King telegraphed Dana Greeley, who was the UUA president during the time, during that board meeting in Boston, and Martin Luther King said, I need you. Be here with me. The board recessed and then reassembled on the Pettus Bridge in Alabama. 2/3 of all Unitarian Universalist church ministers serving churches went to Selma. Anyway, then they had some success, and of course Martin Luther King, had amazing success through nonviolent means, which is what some of our earlier readings today were about. It started to get a little bit more revolutionary, come 1967. And Actually, there was the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalists in May 1967, and the title of the assembly was Responding to a Revolutionary Age. Someone named Saul Olensky gave the Ware Lecture, which was the keynote, and basically another minister, Reverend Dr. Max Gabler, remembers his speech. It was kind of an incendiary speech, but it gave a clue to the future. And Saul Olensky was describing his tactics in dealing with City Hall in Chicago. He said the way to get something accomplished is to polarize the issue. If you could somehow frame the question before the House in such a way that you can demand an up or a down vote, no amendments, just yes or no, no alternatives, even if you start out with only 5% of the people, you can win the day. This turned out to be prophetic because this is exactly what happened in Unitarian Universalist General Assemblies in the next few years. Anyway, in July 1967, we had some big riots in Newark, New Jersey, not really that far from here. And basically there was a black cab driver who was arrested for tailgating a police officer. He was allegedly beaten by police, and then he was put in the hospital. He was moved to another hospital, but people didn't know he was moved, so they thought he died. This set off 6 days of riots, looting, violence, and destruction. This is according to Wikipedia, the quote there. 700 people injured, 26 people dead, close to 1,500 people arrested. In Plainfield, New Jersey, there also were some riots at that time. And again, not too far from here. So in October 1967, the UUA Department of Social Responsibility had an emergency conference on the Unitarian Universalist response to the Black Rebellion. That was the title of this conference. Very interesting. And basically, what happened as soon as the conference started, 30 African-American Unitarian Universalists went to a separate room, locked the door, and stationed someone at the door. It was kind of a militant move. They said, we're forming the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus. And we're going to, let us get our heads together, we're going to make our demands, we'll let you know what they are, and then we'll present them to the assembly. So wow, that's kind of pushing some buttons, you know what I mean? And you could see why, you know, really, with all the BS, for lack of a better word, that people had dealt with for hundreds of years, it does build up after a while. Basically, the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus said, we have some demands, some non-negotiable demands, and they presented them to this bigger emergency conference. They said, we want to start something called the Black Affairs Council, and this is going to be something for the betterment of black culture, and we would like to be funded for $1 million over the next 4 years to do with it what we want to do. But don't worry, we have some really good plans, and we'll let you know what they are. So the funding was going to be $250,000 a year for the next 4 years. And this ended up being a very contentious conference. And, you know, we're in the late 60s here, so we've come a long way. But in the late 60s, even, you know, maybe white Unitarian Universalists who, you know, have the right cause at heart, they grew up in racist households. They're a lot closer to it. So it stirs up some feelings. We weren't quite where we are now, you know. So basically a very contentious conference, but the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, you know, posed this to a vote, and it was voted on to start this Black Affairs Council. And basically, long story short, over the next few years, you see different political maneuvering, different groups within the Unitarian Universalist bigger organization. Just, you know, there were splinter groups gathering to kind of support this move, and then there were splinter groups gathering to kind of protest this move. But what ends up happening is we come to 1968, and the National Conference of the Black Unitarian Universalists was held in Chicago. And they started the Black Affairs Council at that conference. They didn't yet have funding yet from the UUA, but it was kind of in process. You know, basically has to be voted on, ended up being voted on at the next General Assembly, and then ultimately the Board of Trustees has to vote on it. So, but meanwhile, they started doing their thing, getting organized, and the Black Affairs Council was established with 6 black members and 3 white members. And so it was a multiracial effort, and there was a lot of white allies with this. So it was a very good thing. In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And there was another group that sprang up in the Unitarian Universalist Church. It was called Fullback. And basically it stands for Full Recognition and Funding for the Black Affairs Council. So this is kind of a white group that sprang up to give support to the Black Caucus. And Reverend Mendelsohn, who was a white minister at that time, he remembers, partly it was a response to the accusation that the Black Caucus people were separatist. We wanted to demonstrate there was another point of view. We didn't consider them to be separatist at all. We saw the formation of a Black Caucus as being legitimate in the face of a special situation of these times. And the other reason was to make clear to other whites that there was strong white support for the Black Affairs Council. It was a genuine partnership effort on the part of whites with blacks to establish this council to create a new, more powerful intervention of our religious movement into the expanding circles of racial justice. So, I hope I'm not going too fast, but we'll run out of time otherwise. But basically, if we get to May 1968, General Assembly is held in Cleveland. And basically, it was put on the agenda whether Unitarians are really going to put our money where our mouth is and fund this council $250,000 a year for the next 4 years. And from the start, there's a big tension in the atmosphere at this General Assembly. Miriam Barnes remembers, "I have never seen such an emotional orgy in all my life." And the leader of the Black Caucus was a man named Hayward Henry, a young black man who was apparently an amazing orator. So she says Hayward Henry was an incredible orator. He just swept everyone off their feet. And Hayward Henry said this. He said, "We have missed a very simple question. The question is, who will the black community follow? Those who believe in its own participation and right to self-determination, as our caucuses have attempted to investigate with them, or those who offer paternalistic approaches? The reality of the moment to us is very clear. It should also be clear to you. This is the most viable opportunity that we'll ever have to be the Unitarian Universalist that we really want to be." But there's a little catch. Again, it's kind of confrontational. So the Black Affairs Council, they're insisting, oh, by the way, if you give us this $250,000 a year, you can't fund this other group that's kind of doing a different approach. There was another group called BAWA, Black and White Action, and it was for more of a kind of a peaceful thing. It wasn't as confrontational of a group, but they were trying to make progress as well. But the Black Caucus and the Black Affairs Council kind of considered them the enemy. So there was like a split even among the African Americans of the Unitarian Universalists. So the Black Affairs Council says, you give us the money, and by the way, give them nothing. If you give them something, we're gone. So on the third day of the GA, in an atmosphere of extraordinary emotion and tension, quote unquote, it came down to the final two pro and con speakers before the vote. Reverend Gordon Gibson, who was a young minister at the time, he remembers boldly saying to President Greeley, the head of the UUA at the time, Greeley was coming up to speak at the con part, and the young minister was at the pro, trying to put the pro point of view for the funding. And so the head guy approaches, and the young minister says, "My God, Dana, you've spoken on this issue 3 or 4 times already. We know what you have to say. Why don't you let someone else talk?" And he says, Mr. Greeley, who is usually every inch the gentleman, 3-piece suit, unflappingly gentlemanlike demeanor, responded by reaching out and shoving my chest. Crazy, right? It was painful having that level of antagonistic energy in the room. And guess what? The delegates of that General Assembly voted 836 to 326, 72% majority, to form the Black Affairs Council, to fund it from the UUA budget, $250,000 a year for 4 years. Let's have a round of applause for the UUA 1968. And, of course, the Black and White Action Group got 0. Not cool, right? But it would have been nice to fund different approaches and see how far they each could get. But, politics. Even in church, it's politics, right? Okay, come June 1968, there's a UUA Board of Trustees meeting. They realize they don't really have that much money to do what they just said they wanted to do. It's good. We got to laugh about it now because it ends up being kind of a tragedy. But anyway, Lawrence Ladd, who was part of a group called the Liberal Religious Youth. Anyone remember those? That was, I guess, in the 60s, a group of the Unitarian Universalist Church. He says the Black Affairs Council was added to a budget that was already hopelessly unrealistic, thanks to years of irresponsible decisions by the UUA board. And Reverend Gordon Gibson remembers there was a wonderful opportunity in June, July, August 1968 to raise an incredible amount of money from Unitarian Universalists who had given a very clear indication that this was a program they were behind. But almost nothing came out of the leadership to capture that energy from Cleveland. And what if it had been handled differently? Of course, hindsight is 20/20. You always see things that you could have handled things different. But it just, time moves. This is how the history proceeded, okay? Meanwhile, the first meeting of the funded Black Affairs Council is June 1968. And they submitted 60 proposals, basically kind of like a black reparations, but as far as just trying to make a difference in civil rights and in black culture, to empower black culture. Emphasis on black education, political repression, economic exploitation, how to fix it, educational, cultural development of African Americans, community organizing, corporate responsibility. And Joseph Samples, who was a member of the Black Caucus, he says, it was a feeling of liberation. At long last, blacks were being discovered as an integral part of the association. We were doing something for black folks, and in many cases we were successful at doing it. Reverend John Gibbons remembers that the Black Affairs Council invested in a little-known California professor named Ron Karenga, who was pursuing his dream of beginning an African-American winter holiday that came to be called Kwanzaa. I don't know if you knew, Unitarian Universalist had something to do with that. We provided the seed money for it. So again, let's give us a round. Let's some applause. These things they go south from here, kind of. But let's celebrate. We gotta, because I think a lot of times people paint a negative picture on this whole time. But we got to look at the good and the bad. Yeah, that's what I think. So anyway, seed money for Kwanzaa and lots of other good projects as well. Anyway, May 1969, the UUA. This is now a year later. The Board of Trustees meeting. They're having trouble with those finances. So they decide to do a little something which some people say was very political and sneaky, and some people say makes complete sense. They said, you know what, we made this commitment for 4 years. Let's just take it year by year. So let's put it on the agenda this year's General Assembly in 1969, whether we should renew the funding for this year, the $250,000 a year, okay? This is going to outrage a lot of people who could have sworn that they voted on a 4-year funding, you know? But that's what they decided to do, and they decided to put it last on the agenda so they could go through a lot of other stuff at the General Assembly. Oh, low blow, right? Well, people found out, and they freaked out. And again, long story short, okay, but Reverend John Gibbons remembers the mood at the first sessions was dire, because basically what the first thing they're trying to do once they found out is change the agenda to move it to be the front of the agenda, the top of the agenda, instead of at the end. And this is like a whole struggle in itself. So Reverend John Gibbons remembers the mood was dire. It was a crisis atmosphere, a lot of political maneuvering, very contentious. There was a notable shoving match, again the shoving, that I engaged with Max Gabler, a minister who was the leader of BAWA, B-A-W-A. Again, Reverend John Gibbons telling this as a minister. They're shoving each other. We were waiting at one of the microphones to speak. Max stepped out of line. And this was like, he gave up his place in line, so I wasn't cutting him. Look at how immature this is, but this is the story. So he got out of line. I wasn't cutting him. So when he returned, I had taken his place. Max came to me and bumped me and pushed me, and I pushed back. Considerable rudeness on all sides. Okay, then there was this interesting thing. The Black Caucus does this thing called a microphone possession, where basically they were even taking the microphone and wrapping it under their clothes and not letting anyone speak. So pretty crazy. And finally it comes to a vote, and it wasn't a majority to change the agenda. So moderator says motion fails, and all the black delegates, practically all of them, got up and left the General Assembly. There was hushed silence, then rustles and boos, catcalls, and the place was in shock. They declared a recess. This is called the walkout. Well, it's leading up to the walkout. And basically they walk out. Jack Mendelson, who was a vice chair of the Black Affairs Council and a white minister of the Arlington Street Church in Boston, which is actually right down the street because this is a Boston General Assembly, he walks out and he finds all those black delegates at the Statler Hotel. I found them all. They were all there. And they were in disarray, weeping, hugging, kissing, saying goodbye. They were going to leave Boston, leave the movement. I asked if I could speak, and they permitted me to speak. I said I was as disappointed and betrayed as they felt. I wish they'd stay around long enough to see if we could do anything about it. I'll go back in the General Assembly. I'll ask for the right to speak. Will you stick around a little longer so we can have a chance to see what kind of support we can get in there? Maybe it's not too late to move it up on the agenda, or just have, no one realized what these dire consequences were that y'all were going to walk out. So they were like, all right, sure, we'll stay here. Go do your thing. So he goes in. He goes to Dana Greeley, put his arm around him. This is the president again. It says, something big is happening here. I want to point a personal privilege to tell these remaining delegates what's going on. And so he gets to speak. He says, I explain the way to understand how they feel is they feel like they've just been told to go to the back of the bus again. Well, there was applause. There was cheers. There was hisses and boos. In the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, there were raised fists. He said, in light of this, I cannot remain here and pretend I'm conducting business as usual. I'm going to go over to Arlington Street Church, and anyone who wants to join me will be welcome to come. So I started down from my platform, walked towards the exit. One of my colleagues, Horace Westwood, I'm imagining he's a white minister, he came up to me and spit in my face. I talked to another colleague, again I'm imagining this is a white minister, Unitarian Universalist, UU, who said, you know, if I'd have had a pistol, I'd have shot you. He told him this later. Okay, again, they're too close to the issue. We got 30, 40 years on us now. We were in a chance to make some more differences. But, there, you know, it's just what a time this was. Anyway, after this white minister's announcement, when he walks out, 400 whites walked out of only 1,300 people who were at the whole thing. So it's a substantial amount. Threatening a denominational split, kind of like what you hear sometimes nowadays. You know, I think the Episcopal Church, there might have been a split over a homosexual type of bishops and stuff like that. This was threatening a denominational split over this. They call this the walkout. And President Greeley remembers in his autobiography, he said there were two most shocking moments for me in the 1969 General Assembly. One occurred when a young black delegate took one of the floor mics, put it under his coat, and wouldn't release it. Never expected to see that at one of our meetings. The second shock came during a speech by Reverend Jack Mendelson. He indicated he was going to leave the assembly. He wanted anyone to leave with him who wanted to. Here's my minister walking out on my board, my administration, my assembly. It was very shocking, you know. Anyway, there's this walkout. Reverend Gordon Gibson remembers it was wrenching to be part of that group, but, you know, there wasn't enough time to decide, am I going to walk out or not? You just did it, you know. And apparently there were TV cameras and everything there, too. I'd love to see this footage. I don't think it's on YouTube yet or anything. Really, right? It's just, wow. Betty Seiden, who was from the Black and White Alternative Group, she went to the podium. She said, I couldn't believe it. I just ran up to the podium without thinking, and I just stood up there and cried and watched people walk out. And anyway, Reverend Robert Eller Isaacs did walk out, was one of those who walked out. He says it was tearful, it was joyous, but we went out singing. We made our way to Arlington Street. We listened to hours and hours and hours of speeches from that pulpit way high up in the air, Arlington Street Church. And, you know, it's a civil rights motion. You know, this is an action at this time. This conference has turned into an action. But finally, the next day, President Greeley actually went over to that church, and he gave a talk, and he was crying up at the podium. Tears streaming down his cheeks, he called us to come home, reminded us we're part of a family. Families don't settle disputes in this way, and we did go back. So they go back to the General Assembly, and they reached an agreement that the agenda will be changed, the vote will be moved up, and again, the vote is taken to fund the Black Affairs Council for the second year. So it was a success after all that madness, okay? Of course, then the reality, the finances get in the way. There's a new president elected at that conference. His name was Reverend Robert West. And again, some people think he was trying to subvert it later on because he didn't agree with this. But again, just look at the books, look at the finances, and we were definitely in the red. So what happens is the UUA Board of Trustees ultimately decides not to stop the funding, you know. So they ended up funding it for, I believe, 2 years, $500,000. Made a difference. We have Kwanzaa on our postage stamps now. I mean, it's a pretty big thing. That's not the only thing we did, but there was some progress, but it was just halfway, you know. So come 1969, 1970, a lot of the Black Unitarian Universalists were disillusioned, including the man who would become our future president, who was Mr. Sinkford, and he was just our president a few years ago. He was one of those who left Unitarian Universalism. Hayward Henry, who was the head of that Black Caucus, he was the amazing speaker. By the 1970s, he joined a Presbyterian church and became a minister with them. So in that sense, it's kind of a failure. We had a lot of African Americans leave, and we haven't been sure yet since then how to bring them back. You know, in some sense, many congregations, they are coming back. There's so many lessons to be learned from this all, and I just try to, again, paint the positive on what we can celebrate. And, you know, what can we learn from it? Maybe we'll have a little discussion. You have any impressions, any thoughts on this history? A good time to reflect on that. Okay, I guess we'll talk about it at hospitality. But let me just read a final, let me see if I have a final quote. Okay. So